Hey guys, today we're going to be changing the bottom bracket in my camber behind me here, and it's a press fit type. Definitely my least favorite type of bottom bracket. The screw-in type is definitely far superior, but we're going to do this one. And before I start, please consider to subscribe, and let's do this thing. So the first step is to wash the bike so that you don't introduce any additional dirt anywhere. On a mountain bike that can be difficult at times to get all the dirt off. Then you can use some gloves if you want. It is quite a dirty job. And then to remove the bottom bracket you need a number 8 Allen key. The longer the better to get that force down there. I have already loosened this one because they can be quite difficult to get off. So first thing, loosen the chain, like so. Loosen the bottom bracket, or rather the crank. You can take the chain off first. Remove the crank, set it aside somewhere. Then there's a spacer. Needs to come out. Keep it also safely somewhere. Then there's a seal, but that can come out if you just push the crank through. Remove the seal. You should clean this before putting it back again. Just gives the bearing extra protection. And then just push the crank out the other side. Clean all this off and this and set it aside safely. Once you have done that, to check that you actually need to have the bottom bracket replaced, just put your fingers in there and move the actual bearing itself. And if it feels in any way grindy or hooking, then you should replace these bearings. In this case, check both sides. Yeah, both bearings should be replaced, although the one side is always better than the other side. Okay, to remove the bearing, there are two ways to remove the bearing. You can either knock it out or you can use a bearing puller, and as I've just bought one, we'll be using that. Having a look at the bearing pulling set itself, but as I say, you don't really need this. You can bash the bearings out. It's got different size connectors here that you'll use to pull the bearing, and then you've got a slide hammer at the top. So I'll be using the biggest one over here to pull the bearings out, so let's do that. Bearing puller itself, it's quite a interesting little piece of device, quite clever. As you tighten this back bolt over here, it pushes a pin into the front here, which then expands these jaws out here, which grab the bearing, hold onto it, and there's a bit of a lip here as well, which is used then to hold onto the bearing and pull it out. So we'll just push this in, like so. You tighten that up. Once you've done that, connect the slide hammer. And then just and then the bearing comes out. As you could see, it was quite an effort to get the bearing out. But one advantage of the bearing puller, it doesn't actually damage the bearing, so if this bearing was okay, you could theoretically put it back in again. Once both bearings have been removed, you can just remove any excess grease that remains inside the bottom bracket. And just clean it thoroughly. As you can see on the bottom bracket here, it has a lip on the inside on both sides to which the bearing will be pushed up against. So you cannot push the bearing further in than it is required. So the bearing that came out is an enduro bearing. Looks like this, and I'm going to be replacing it with these bearings here, NTN bearings, only because I don't think the enduro bearings seem to last, and I think these bearings are a higher quality, so they look like this. Now to actually replace the bearing you need a bearing press, and I've made one of those tools. I didn't buy the tool, I made it, and it consists of basically a threaded rod with a lever on the other side that you're going to be turning, to which there's another, actually like a spanner that goes on it, or nut let's call it, and as you tighten these two things together, it moves together, and by doing that then it'll push the bearing in. But the bearing is then held with a bearing holder, let's call it, or press. And the bearing press obviously is sunk over there, it's got a countersink over there, so you're not pushing against the race of the bearing, you're pushing against the outside of the bearing, so that just fits onto it like that and then gets pushed in. So that'll be the next step. So before we start, we apply a bit of grease to the inside of the bottom bracket where the bearing is going to go. This will make the bearing going easier. Just apply grease all around. Doesn't matter how much grease you put in there, because excess grease will actually just be pushed out like that. Then if you do have a bearing press, do not try to press both bearings in at the same time. I have done this in the past, and it doesn't actually work that well. You can damage the bearing by doing this. Then also just put a little bit of grease on the inside here and on the outside of the bearing itself. Just makes it go easier on the bearing holder like that. That slides on, and then on the other side I'm going to be using a socket to press up against the outside of the bottom bracket like that, and then the actual nut to hold it or push it back into the other side. Once you have the bearing press set up, you just turn the press, which will then push the bearing in. The frame will start making a noise, don't worry about that, it's just the bearing being seated into its holder or its position. Carry on turning until it stops, you get resistance. Don't over tighten it at this point, it has reached its home position. Let's back off the press. And once you've done that, remove the press die over here, and then both bearings are in. Once both bearings have been installed, apply a little bit of grease to the crank. This just makes it a lot easier to slide in from the other side. Push it through. Install the seal next to protect the bearing, and then install the spacer like such. After which the crank can be reinstalled, but before installing that, just apply a little bit more grease to the thread. Take your number 8 Allen key, make sure the orientation of the crank is correct. It'll also give you the direction to which it must be tightened. Tighten it down to 50 Newton meters now. So set your torque range to 50 Newton meters and then just tighten it up. There we go. And then replace the chain. So guys, as you can see, it's quite easy to install the bearings in your bottom bracket. It may seem a little bit scary initially, but once you actually tackle the task, it's quite easy, and it's quite actually a small job. It doesn't take that long. Obviously a lot quicker if you're not trying to film it. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time.